And the one occasion on which they brought evidence, it was evidence before a tribunal, and they admitted, when questioned by Gareth Pierce, the solicitor, they admitted that this evidence they had been obtained by torture from Guantanamo. And the terrorists are not changing our way of life. That's what we are told. But it has been changed. And that's what we have to fight against. And that is why I would urge all of you, and not just all of you here, but each of you try and bring 10 extra people on the 24th. This in some ways is the most important demonstration we're having since the one when we tried to stop the war and failed, before they actually went to war. That's the importance of this, because no one else is doing it. Politics in the bubble, the media and House of Commons bubble, is now remote from reality. They believe their own crap. They believe this stuff. They're shocked. They're shocked when they realize that 2/3 of the population of Britain believes that the bombs were linked to Iraq. I had to debate some of these people after July the 7th. Complete media hacks on the BBC. And I said then, the first opinion poll we have will confirm our opinion. And the BBC guy on some Radio 4 program said, I've been doing some vox pops on the street. And the guy in the studio says, well, what? He said, well, most of them seem to agree with this line, that it's the Iraq war. And then we heard some of the vox pops, and finally, in desperation, they went to someone they thought would be very reactionary, the poor, much maligned London taxi driver who drives a black cab. And they were shocked in the studio. The BBC reporter on the street went into the black cab and said, hi, can I have a word with you? He said, yeah, what's it, mate? He said, why do you think the bombs fell? It's Iraq, innit? End of argument. And this guy was not a sophisticated political theoretician. He just knew, as the bulk of people knew, it was so obvious. And they tried to deny it. And Blair is still in denial. No one else is in this country now, including his third-rate cabinet. They know it. Jack Straw knows it. We've now got the Downing Street dossier published before the war. When they agreed they were going to go to war, and in this dossier, secret Downing Street dossier, Jack Straw says the evidence is very thin for WMD. They knew it was a lie. It wasn't just Richard Pearl who knew it was a lie. Tony Blair knew it was a lie. Jack Straw knew it was a lie. They all knew it was a lie, and it was obvious at the time. But it was to rush the country in this war. So this is our responsibility now, to defend, to take the government on, demand the withdrawal of troops, hope that it triggers off something in Parliament, say this is the only way to bring peace. And then they ask the question, but if we now withdraw the troops, it will be like caving in to terrorists. Excuse me, this is not the Second World War we are talking about. This is the war you've waged on a totally innocent people. It's a war you support. This war was wrong in the first place. You should never have been there. So pull out now like the Spanish did, in time, before there are more disasters. Who else will say this to them? And that's why we need a big show of strength. And secondly, of course, as others have stressed, it's on the question of civil liberties. Extremely important to make a big fight on this and saying it's intolerable and unacceptable, and you will be fought every inch of the way. And the last point, just to add to some of the things that have been said, this business in New Orleans, whenever these disasters happen, it's the poor who suffer. I was actually very upset when I saw what was going on in the screen, because I knew that this was 2/3 or 3/4 a poor black city. I knew that. And so I knew what would happen. It's the poor who would suffer. The rich get away. They have helicopters. They have helicopter pads. They are warned weeks in advance. They pull out of it. It's the poor who suffer. And what was interesting, in addition to what John said, of the big debates on American television on Iraq, right-wing journalists from Fox Television, the most vicious, hate-filled television channel in that country, shaken stiff when they see a US soldier, a woman, a black woman and her kid come to ask this soldier for some water. Where can we find water? And he points a gun at her head.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's going on. But the other point about that is that what people, certainly in Europe and the rest of the world, but including in parts of white America, saw when these films went on the screen every single day, they said, my God, this is like a third world country. Yes. There's poverty in the United States too. Very deep poverty, which no one talks about. Because the images we see of America are the images of power constantly, and the images of richness, and the images of wealth, and Hollywood, and all the soap operas which British television kindly buys from them at very cheap rates and puts on non-stop on all its television channels. That's the image you have of America. But it's a bogus image, because it is also one of the poorest countries in the world, which has 1/6 of every young black person in the United States between the ages of 16 and 24 is in prison. 1 out of 6. It's a society which incarcerates its youth. No one talks about this because, you know, it's meant to be a symbol of richness. And this is the weakness of that country. And this is what I always say, because I go to that country a lot, to people in the anti-war movement here. We are very critical of the American ruling elite and their military, but unless we find allies within the United States to help defeat the American empire, we're not going to get very far. And we are finding allies increasingly, not just now in amongst the poor of New Orleans, who will never forget this, nor will blacks in Mississippi, nor will the poor in other parts of the country. But when Cindy Sheehan went and sat outside Bush's ranch, it created a storm. Why? Because suddenly people remembered the war, and it made the war central again. And when the police started moving her off, an amazing thing happened. That George Bush's neighbor, a very rich rancher, just got very offended by that. And he said, this is not on. This is a war I don't support. Come onto my ranch and use my ranch as a base of, once she made that clear, people from all over the states turned up at the camp on a neighboring ranch, much closer than they would have been outside the ranch to George Bush, so he had to leave by helicopter. So all I'm saying is that these things take place and happen once you launch and unleash wars like this. You have consequences which no one can predict, certainly not the people who went to war. They didn't predict there would be a resistance in Iraq. Some of us did. We said there will be a resistance. This is not going to be a rerun of Kosovo. You are going to have a big resistance in Iraq. Oh, you people live in a dreamland. There has been a big resistance in Iraq. Then they thought they would rush through a constitution quickly drafted in Washington and the US Embassy in Iraq, trying to deny an important section of the population its basic rights. It's backfired. Thirdly, they constantly try and divide the Iraqi population into Sunni or Shia. BBC correspondents, CNN correspondents, when they go and interview someone, who are you? Are you a Sunni or a Shia? Many of them say we are Iraqis. But they want to know this. Why? Because historically, imperial rule and colonization always relies on divide and rule, divide and rule, divide and rule. So you talk just about Sunnis and Shias. And by talking about it and by giving money to some of them, you make them into what they are. So it's not working in Iraq, and it's not going to work in Palestine either, despite this big withdrawal from Gaza. 3,000 journalists from the West lined up to film these settlers being taken away. 3,000 journalists from the West. Where are they every single day when Sharon and his gangsters kill Palestinians? Where are they? And Blair has the nerve then to stand up in Parliament and tell another lie. He says publicly, Israel has no greater or closer friend than this government. We know what he's trying to do, but surely he must know it's a lie, because the United States government is even greater and closer to Israel than Blair could ever be. So even when he's trying to tell people I'm on your side, he has to lie. It's become a genetic problem with New Labour. So this is the world we live in, and this is a complex world, and there are no immediate solutions and there are no easy solutions. And so we've got to dig in for a long haul. Sometimes I know people say to me when I go around and speak and say, oh, Tariq, not another demonstration. I said, what else can we do? Tell me. We're not in favor of throwing bombs or violence. That's the only other option if you want something tougher, more muscular. We are not in favor of that because we have an immediate aim to get the troops home, but we have a long-term aim as well to try and change the way in which this society is run. And that's why the victory in Bow and Bethnal Green on election night was a very important victory for us. To take on a New Labour warmonger MP and defeat her. And I end on one note. I was in Edinburgh some weeks ago at the Edinburgh Literature Festival, Book Festival, and there was a big, big audience, 800-900 people, and I was talking about this crisis in a more literary way, should we say. But nonetheless, I was talking about it, and at the end, 6 or 7 people raised their hands and said, well, we agree with you. And I said that I had laid great stress on the fact that the electoral system in this country is bankrupt, corrupt, undemocratic. It does not reflect the will of the population, and there's a big crisis of representation here. Because Blair has been elected with 35% of the electoral vote, of the people who voted, and 1/5 of the electorate, barely. And he's got a large majority. And it's the lowest vote any European government has won to be in power. And he behaves as if he's ruling on behalf of every single one. And so I said in Scotland, we have to fight against this extremely undemocratic electoral system. And one of them said, but how can we? We don't have any power. And I said, both England and Scotland have very strong traditions of peasant revolts. It's time. It's time because they are treating citizens now like the old feudal lords used to treat peasants. You have no rights at all. I said we have a radical tradition of peasant revolts, and then we have a big tradition of the Chartist movement, the early working class movement, which started in Manchester and other parts of, and then spread to other parts of the country, and that demanded the right to vote and adult franchise and annual parliaments. And they tried to defeat it, but ultimately it won. And that is the level on which we've got to think. The anti-war movement is one thing, which is an immediate duty. But in a longer term, it will be us, not pro-capitalist people, who will fight to enhance and strengthen democratic institutions, because ultimately it's us who has more confidence in ordinary working people in this country.